Morning all. There was an absolutely fantastic game played between Magnus Carlsen and Boris Gelfand yesterday in the first round of the Zurich Chess Challenge. Magnus Carlsen's first game since becoming World Chess Champion on the classical time control. The opening was an English opening, C4 by Magnus, and we get a standard looking Slav triangle, very popular at Grandmaster levels these days. Magnus chooses a very rare move here, but statistically apparently it does quite well. Queen A4, both sides castled, and now knight D7 trying to exploit the queen on A4. So knight B6 as a threat to pick up the C pawn. The queen just dropped back. Knight F6, and a bit of cat and mouse here. Bishop F4, Bishop F5, kicking the queen again. So tempo's been exchanged, but Queen B3. Unless black wants to play a slightly awkward looking Queen C8, Queen B6 looks logical. So out of the opening, Magnus has a solid position, and can he use something with this small advantage he might have here? So let's have a look with Qb6 as well. Knight D2, and now Knight E4. Looks as though knight takes D4 is quite annoying potentially. For example, knight takes, there's bishop takes. Magnus just supports his d pawn with e3, so fairly solid stuff so far. Very solid position. Now queen takes b3, and Magnus takes with the a pawn. He doesn't mind the double pawns here. There's a bit of pressure down this a file, which could be useful later. Knight a6, which seems to be very logical to be able to sit on front of those double pawns as well, and maybe come in to attack some squares later. It looks like a fairly natural move to play. But can it be punished? Well, in this position now, Magnus takes on d5, so he's leaving the d pawn a little bit exposed here, a little bit more exposed. C takes d, so not able to play e takes, didn't wait for e6, say. So is this d pawn a little bit of a problem? Well, at the moment, it looks as though this bishop is a long way off doing anything on the diagonal. It looks as though black's position is fairly solid, and here is the first really remarkable dramatic move of the game. I wonder if you can spot what Magnus Carlsen played in this position. I mean, it's to do with if you want to really celebrate this bishop along the diagonal, what move would you consider playing here if I gave you 10 seconds starting from now? Okay, Magnus played g4, quite an amazing looking move, and I think is targeting this d5 pawn. It's slightly loose here in these variations. For example, if knight takes, I think we can just play knight takes d2, and if bishop, if black doesn't want to lose the centre pawn for a flank pawn, because this just looks very nice for white, this pressure on b7, these bishops here. If black wants to try and defend e6, it looks quite passive, and actually this a file comes in handy with rook a5. So it just shows that the d5 pawn can be quite vulnerable in this position now after g4. It's trying to liberate this bishop across this diagonal. So Boris chose actually here bishop takes g4, and now Magnus took on e4. So he's doubling black's pawns now, but black is a pawn up, knight d2. So what is going on here? Well, if black just loses the pawn without a fight here, then basically this bishop is really liberated on the diagonal. All of white's pieces seem quite aggressive there, so the pawn is actually protected. I don't know what else actually black can consider doing. From an engine point of view, it looks as though bishop e2 might be quite useful. Bishop e2. But then again, as soon as white picks up this e pawn, this pressure on the queen side is really good. This bishop has come to life. So Boris actually plays a move which you don't really generally, you want to take great caution playing when you're playing black, especially against Magnus Carlsen. F5, because fundamentally black is weakening this diagonal. This could be very handy tactically just to get to black's king. The e6 square is a bit more vulnerable. Okay, but white has invested a pawn to do this. So where is the actual tangible compensation? And also, the double pawns. This knight could potentially be useful one day. So what's the idea? Well, white has to try and wrench open this bishop. It can't be locked in by this pawn. You know, knight c4 is no problem for black. This is not the idea at all. The idea is to wrench open this diagonal. So f3. So a gambit of a pawn, temporary. Now, if e takes, knight takes. I mean, what is the compensation here for the pawn? Basically, it looks as though knight e5 is a very strong move in this position. Just that bishop pressurizing b7. That will present very serious difficulties here. So actually, this position was avoided by Boris Gelfand. So he didn't actually take on f3. He played actually e5. This might actually be the first real mistake of the game, at least from an engine perspective. It's a very complicated position. But if e takes f3, let's just have a quick look at this position. Rook ad8, and this looks very important actually to try and control this d5 square from things like knight g5 or knight e5 with bishop d5 in view. Now here, something like knight g5 threatens actually knight e6. And it's just very sharp positions. You know, e5, can black actually consider sacrificing an exchange potentially? D takes e5. Rook fe8. Bishop takes b7. This just shows that actually white could end up on top even in this variation. White has quite significant pressure here. But it looks as though, you know, white's pawns are absolutely shattered. But from an engine point of view, this is actually quite light for white. If rook e7 here, bishop b5, this diagonal is still, you know, quite sensitive. So even this variation of taking the pawn, it's very, very dangerous for black. So Boris decided actually to just lash out with his own pawn sack e5. Temporary pawn sack in return. After d takes e5, now he takes on f3. So at least he's shut down this bishop for the moment. After knight takes f3, there is still a major concern here about either knight d4 or knight g5. With the idea of bishop d5 later, this diagonal is extremely sensitive. Boris played here now rook ae8, so there's great interest in getting this pawn back potentially with something like bishop takes f3 and bishop takes e5. This pawn is held on though with rook a5, so white still has this very important idea of knight d4 here or knight g5 with bishop d5 in mind. Or just even knight d2. It's just a very dangerous diagonal once this bishop gets to d5 and starts also attacking b7. That will be vulnerable as well. We see now black playing knight b4, and if black's given time, then knight c6 is going to be good, hitting the rook, and e5. So knight d4 serves two purposes. It stops the use of knight c6, and potentially this knight, if it can be kicked away, for example, then bishop d5 will be dangerous again. So rook b5 is quite serious here. This is a loose piece which needs to be addressed somehow, or at least getting this pawn out the firing line as well. b6 is chosen, hitting the rook, offering the a7 pawn. A rook on the 7th rank is particularly dangerous, especially with the absence of this pawn being moved forward. Black's king safety is a little bit more suspect than it would usually be. Black now plays bishop takes e5. What else? It's a difficult position here. White is actually threatening, if that pawn isn't taken, white is actually threatening something like e6. And that's a very, very dangerous pawn to have. So it's taken off here. And now bishop h6, attacking the rook. Black doesn't really want to lose the exchange. He plays actually rook f6. Let's have a look if rook f7 instead. this diagonal is just very sensitive here. So if this knight is the only thing stopping the use of d5, rook a4 here. What is black actually doing? It has to protect that knight. White could actually have a nice advantage though, just taking that a file, for example, or maybe knight c6. This is quite dangerous. But anyway, so actually rook f6 was played, and we see now h3, which is usefully putting the bishop on h5 away from f5. That could be vulnerable pretty soon, this f5 pawn. This diagonal now is only protected by that knight on b4. Now there's a fantastic move here based on the d5 square. I wonder if you can spot it if I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, an absolutely fantastic move, knight c2, trying to deflect that knight away from d5. So if knight takes c2 here, bishop d5 check is really good for white. If king h8, that's a disaster. Bishop g7 is checkmate. And if black has to play something like this, then this is a very nasty pin to celebrate. Rook c1, for example. And there's also back row issues. So for example, knight here, bishop takes, and black cannot like take here without being mated. So this is not the sort of thing you want to happen. So knight c2, that cannot be taken here without incurring massive disadvantage. Boris chose what probably is the best move in the position, g5, attacking the bishop in return. Now we see bishop takes g5. And again, you might think, well, wouldn't it be like two pieces if knight takes c2? Let's have a look at knight takes c2 again. Knight takes c2 here. We can just take on f6. And the problem here, if bishop takes, then we have rook takes f5, hitting both bishops. And white's going to be up here. White's the exchange up in this position. So that shows the importance of h3 driving the bishop to f5 here. It's more of a tactical liability on f5. That f5 is more sensitive now in this variation, in this particular variation. So g5, bishop takes g5. We see rook g6. So f5 is a bit loose here. And actually, again, the knight is just left on c2 remarkably, with rook takes f5. Incredible stuff. So what's happening here? Why can't the knight be taken now? Knight takes c2 in this position. Bishop d5 check, king h8. There's a brilliant tactic here. I wonder if you can spot it in this variation. So white to play here, what would you play as white? What did Magnus have in mind? Okay, I'm just going to show you. Rook takes e5 again. These bishops and the rook really work well against the king here. If taking, it's a mate in 3 check. If king g7, rook g8, mate. So fantastic stuff that this knight cannot be taken again in this position. So we see black trying now h6. Now Magnus just takes, he doesn't take the knight, he takes the pawn. I think that's one of the best moves in the position, but I think taking the knight was actually a good move as well. Knight takes b4. This is actually good for white as well, this position. It's going to be a little bit better for white. White is 2 pawns up, but the game continuation has a lot more tension in the position, a lot more pieces still on actually. Bishop takes h6. So hitting now this bishop on h5. So again, knight takes c2. We can actually just play rook takes h5 here, and also the bishop's conveniently protecting e3. So this is quite nice for white, and this bishop's fantastic now as well on this diagonal. Fantastic bishop there. So black actually played here Rook takes h6. Having to not play knight takes c2 for so many moves. And now finally the knight on c2 does take on b4. So at the moment now, from that pawn sacrifice, white is at the moment 3 pawns up, believe it or not. Now 2 pawns up after bishop takes b2, but it was only a double pawn, so 2 significant pawns up. This e3 pawn is being attacked at the moment, but I think that's might not even be a threat here, because of all these other ideas like bishop d5 and stuff. White actually plays knight d5, not just supporting the pawn but also more aggressively knight e7 check. Things are starting to go around black's king here in a dangerous manner. So the immediate threat now isn't just knight e7 though, there's also knight f4 is pretty dangerous. Maybe just trying to play for bishop d5 later and rook g5, making a target out of the h5 bishop. Black plays now king h8, and now with that rook on the 7th, you might think this is a little bit odd to just chase a pawn, but rook b6, sorry, rook b7 is played. The knight is supporting an attack on that b6 pawn. Black doesn't really want to lose every single pawn. He's 2 pawns down already. He counterattacks the b3 pawn that's just moved, and now tries rook g8. It seems possible actually to take here on b6 in this position, but Magnus chooses a less materialistic move. He just plays knight e7, attacking the rook. Where can the rook move in this position? It's quite uncomfortable. If, for example, well, it's awkward choices. The rook moved to d8, and now Magnus played bishop e4, and it looks as though everything's converging on the g6 square. White can now play rook g5 and potentially that really scary knight g6. Almost getting a mating net potentially out of this. Bishop f6 trying to repulse these attacking pieces, but this fails a little bit to a nasty pin exploitation. Rook takes b6, so the bishop is now pinned to the rook, so 3 pawns up after this rook takes b6. Black tries to just renew that threat. It seems like a totally lost position here, but he tries king g7 as though bishop takes e7. Okay, that needs to be addressed, and it's addressed elegantly now with just rook f2. So the rook is finding a way to check the king, to kick it away from the protection of the h6 rook. And here, actually, 3 pawns down, Boris Gelfand resigned. It's just an incredible game. It's quite a profound game. If bishop takes e7, we just win that rook on h6. But I think the really impressive moment of this game, where things started to go terribly wrong, was this ingenious pawn sack. It looked as though black had a fairly solid position until we get this position. It looks as though white's got structural damage, and this bishop, you know, had been hemmed in for a lot of the game, but now it's kind of being liberated totally with this g4. So I guess if we rewind back further, you know, this knight f6 did lose the pressure on that g4 square. So g4, very tactical positional move here. It kind of liberated white's pieces dramatically in this continuation after knight takes, d takes, knight d2, causing black, you know, as well to weaken the diagonal. So it's not just about improving the scope of this bishop, creating loads of weaknesses in black's camp after f5. So there's continual issues about the d5 square for this bishop getting to d5. But then we have this other remarkable stage soon after this as a logical chain reaction, that although this counter pawn sack happened, black is trying to hold on to that d5 square White's got this ingenious Rook A5 as well, using the A file, just safeguarding E5. But here, this knight is the only thing holding the D5 square. So from that initial pawn sacrifice, weakening the diagonal, extending the scope of the bishop, both of those ingredients are coming together here for White to try and tap into this diagonal with this ingenious knight C2 coming up. So Black having to give up a pawn here. What else was Black actually doing though, if not B6? You know, if A6, for example, just as an example, just I think here, bishop takes B7, and then Rook A4 to follow with bishop D5 after that. It's just very, very unpleasant for Black, this sort of position. So trying to give up the A pawn seems a bit weird, but I don't know what else Black is doing. He's keeping the B pawn and losing the A pawn instead. What he thought might be a lesser evil. So losing the A pawn here, and getting the pawn back as well, getting that pawn back. But here again, getting the pawn back costs control of H6. It's a remarkable set of chain reactions here from the initial G4. So White getting into the dart squares now. Black's king safety is being really questioned here, and all the time this Rook A4 for bishop D5. So if Rook F7, Rook A4, so Rook F6, and then it's just amazing how things start to revolve around king safety now with that bishop on H6. It's just too dangerous now. After knight C2, this gets just really scary now for the dart squares as well as the light square diagonal. It seems to be like a positional attacking masterpiece at different levels if you look at this game. So bishop takes G5, Rook takes F5, and Black really is in trouble now. He's actually starting to lose material. He can never afford to like take here because of this bishop D5. And then Rook E5. It's amazing tactics against Black's king being combined with positional play. What a remarkable game. What a fantastic first game. Great for the spectators. Very exciting pawn sacrifice here. And then going 3 pawns up in this final position. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.